A millionaire took his daughter to the park, and a little beggar girl shouted, "She's my twin sister." The wind rustled through the tall oaks that lined the edges of New York City's Central Park. It was a rare Saturday when George Carter, a self-made millionaire and CEO of a growing tech company, found himself free from the constant buzz of meetings and deadlines. He was determined to spend the day with his 10-year-old daughter, Amelia, who had been quietly yearning for his attention. Amelia, with her chestnut hair tied in a loose braid and a book tucked under her arm, was the spitting image of her late mother, Eleanor. George felt a pang of guilt every time he looked at her. Since Eleanor's passing 5 years ago, he'd buried himself in work, leaving little room for the kind of connection Amelia deserved. "Daddy, push me higher!" Amelia's voice broke through his thoughts as she swung back and forth on the playground swing. George smiled faintly and stepped forward, giving her a gentle push. He was trying, but the gap between them felt as wide as the Hudson River. As George watched Amelia's laughter ripple through the air, he noticed another child standing nearby, clutching a small stuffed bear. The girl had the same striking chestnut hair as Amelia, braided in a nearly identical way. For a moment, George thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The girl, Willow, looked at Amelia with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Then she turned her gaze to George, her big, curious eyes locking with his. "Hi," Willow said, her voice soft but clear. "Are you Amelia's dad?" George blinked, taken aback. "Yes, I am." "And you are—" "I'm Willow." She hesitated, then added, "I think I might be her sister." Amelia, now standing beside George, tilted her head. "What do you mean, sister?" Willow stepped closer, her small frame trembling slightly, as if she feared she'd said too much. "We look the same, don't we?" George studied the girl more closely. She did look eerily similar to Amelia, the same delicate features, the same shade of chestnut hair. But it wasn't just their faces. On the side of Willow's neck, just below her ear, was a faint birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. George's heart skipped a beat. Amelia had the exact same mark. "Where are your parents?" George asked, his tone firm but not unkind. "I don't have any," Willow replied matter-of-factly. "I live with Beatrice. She said you'd come one day." "Beatrice?" George frowned, trying to piece together the strange puzzle unfolding before him. Willow nodded. "She's my guardian. She told me stories about how I might have a family out there, and I think it's you." Amelia looked at Willow, her brow furrowed in confusion and a hint of disbelief. "This is crazy. How could we be sisters? I've never even met you." "I don't know," Willow admitted, her voice trembling now. "But Beatrice said I'd know you when I saw you, and I think she was right." George crouched down to Willow's level, his analytical mind racing. "Where can I find Beatrice? I'd like to talk to her." Willow hesitated before pointing toward the other side of the park. "She's sitting on the bench near the fountain, but please don't get her in trouble." George nodded, his expression softening. "No one's getting in trouble. Let's go talk to her." As they approached the fountain, George's thoughts swirled with questions. Who was this girl, and how could she possibly be connected to his family? Sitting on the bench was an elderly woman with a kind but weary face, her hands folded over a worn purse. She looked up as they approached, her eyes landing on Willow with a mixture of protectiveness and resignation. "You must be George Carter," she said before he could introduce himself. George stopped in his tracks. "How do you know my name?" Beatrice sighed, her shoulders sinking. "Because Eleanor told me about you before she died. She made me promise to keep Willow safe until the time was right." George's chest tightened at the mention of Eleanor. "What are you talking about? Why would Eleanor—" "She knew something you didn't," Beatrice interrupted gently. "Something about the day Amelia and Willow were born." George felt the ground shift beneath him. "The day they were born? Are you saying—" "Yes," Beatrice said, her voice firm despite the emotion in her eyes. "Willow is Amelia's twin sister, and Eleanor knew she'd been taken from you." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap, leaving George and Amelia speechless. Willow stood quietly by, clutching her stuffed bear as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. George's mind raced, grappling with the enormity of what he'd just learned. If what Beatrice was saying was true, Then the life he thought he knew was built on a lie that Eleanor had tried to expose. As he looked at Willow, then at Amelia, George felt a flicker of determination ignite within him. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but one thing was certain. He owed it to both girls, and to Eleanor's memory, to uncover the truth. The drive back to George's Upper West Side townhouse was uncharacteristically silent. Amelia sat in the back seat, clutching her book tightly, her eyes flicking toward Willow, who sat beside her, staring out the window. George, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, couldn't shake Beatrice's words from his mind. Willow is Amelia's twin sister. The idea was absurd, impossible. And yet, as he glanced at the rearview mirror, the truth seemed to stare back at him in the uncanny resemblance between the two girls. Once home, George ushered them inside. The townhouse, sleek and modern with its minimalist decor, suddenly felt cold and sterile under the weight of what had just happened. "Sit," George said, gesturing toward the couch. Willow obeyed without question, her small frame dwarfed by the plush cushions. Amelia hesitated, but eventually sat beside her, keeping a cautious distance. George paced the room. "Beatrice's story doesn't make sense. Hospitals don't just separate twins at birth. It's unethical, illegal." He paused, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. Unless what?" Amelia asked softly, her voice cutting through the tension. George sighed. "Unless someone wanted it to happen." The room fell silent. "I don't understand," Amelia said, her brow furrowed. "Why would anyone take my sister?" "I don't know," George admitted, his voice heavy, "but I intend to find out." Willow shifted uncomfortably. "Beatrice didn't know everything. She said Eleanor was the one who figured it out. That's why she asked Beatrice to take me in." George stopped pacing. "Why would Eleanor keep this from me?" "She was trying to protect you," Willow said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Protect me from what?" George demanded, his frustration boiling over. Willow shrank back and Amelia glared at her father. "You're scaring her, Dad." George exhaled, realizing he needed to rein in his emotions. He crouched down in front of Willow. "I'm sorry. I just need to understand. Do you remember anything at all that could help us?" Willow hesitated, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. "Beatrice said Eleanor left clues, in stories, books. She said you'd know what to do when you found them." George's stomach dropped. He'd always dismissed Eleanor's love for writing as a quirky hobby, something she indulged in during her free time. But now, her stories took on a new significance. "Wait here," George said abruptly, heading for his study. Amelia turned to Willow. "Do you think he's mad at us?" Willow shook her head. "No, I think he's mad at whoever did this." A few minutes later, George returned, carrying a small stack of books. Amelia's eyes widened when she recognized the covers. "Mom's books," George nodded, flipping through the pages of the first one. "She wrote these for you, Amelia, but I never paid much attention to them. Now I'm wondering if there's more to them than I realized." He handed one to Amelia and another to Willow. "Look for anything strange, words, symbols, anything that stands out." The three of them worked in silence, flipping through the brightly illustrated pages. The stories were whimsical tales of adventure and bravery, but as George examined them more closely, he began to notice patterns. Certain words were underlined in red ink, others were written in slightly different handwriting, as if they'd been added later. "Here," George said, pointing to a page. "This doesn't belong." Amelia leaned over to see. The word hospital was scrawled in the margin, next to an illustration of a large white building. Willow's eyes lit up. "That's it. Beatrice said the hospital was the key." George frowned. "What hospital?" "I don't know," Willow admitted. "But Beatrice said Eleanor found out something bad happened there." George's mind was already racing. If the hospital where Amelia and Willow were born held answers, he'd find them. But this wasn't a task he could take on alone. The next morning, George made a call to a trusted friend, a retired journalist named Victor Reynolds. Victor had a reputation for digging up the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. "George," Victor said when he answered, "haven't heard from you in years. What's going on?" "I need your help," George said without preamble. "It's about my daughters, Both of them. Victor was silent for a moment. Daughters? Last I checked, you only had one. It's complicated, George replied, glancing at Willow, who was quietly eating breakfast at the kitchen counter. I think there's been some kind of cover-up. I need to track down records from the hospital where Amelia was born. Can you help? Victor hesitated. That's a tall order. Hospital records are sealed tight these days. But if someone's hiding something, I'll find it. Thank you, George said. I'll send you the details. As he hung up, George felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since meeting Willow, he had a tangible lead. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The answers they sought wouldn't come easily, and whoever had orchestrated this scheme wouldn't let the truth come to light without a fight. The study was bathed in the warm glow of mid-morning light as George sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of Eleanor's books and journals. Amelia and Willow were perched on the floor, flipping through pages with a mixture of curiosity and urgency. The house, normally quiet, was alive with the sound of turning pages and whispered observations. "Dad, look at this," Amelia said, holding up a book titled The Star Sisters. The cover featured two girls holding hands beneath a sky full of constellations. "Isn't this about twins?" George took the book, scanning the first few pages. The story was about two sisters separated by a storm, destined to reunite by following a trail of stars. At first, it had seemed like a simple bedtime tale. Now it felt like Eleanor was speaking directly to them from the past. "Willow," George said, motioning for her to come closer. "Does this story sound familiar to you?" Willow nodded, clutching her stuffed bear. "Beatrice used to read it to me. She said it was important." George opened the book to a random page and noticed something unusual. A faint series of dots and dashes lined the margins. "Morse code," he muttered under his breath. "What's Morse code?" Amelia asked, peering over his shoulder. "It's a way of encoding messages using dots and dashes," George explained, his voice tinged with excitement. He grabbed a notepad and began translating the marks. The process was slow, but after a few minutes, he had pieced together the message: St. Mary's Medical Center, room 214. "What does that mean?" Amelia asked, her brow furrowed. "It's the hospital where you were born," George replied, his pulse quickening. "Room 214 might be where Eleanor found something." Later that day, George called Victor to update him. "The name of the hospital is St. Mary's Medical Center," George said, "and there's a specific room mentioned, 214. Victor whistled on the other end of the line. St. Mary's is notorious for keeping things hush-hush. If something shady went down there, it'll be buried deep. "Can you dig into it?" George asked. "I'll start right away," Victor said. "But you should check it out in person, too. Sometimes old buildings keep secrets in the strangest places." That afternoon, George, Amelia, and Willow drove to St. Mary's Medical Center. The imposing grey building loomed over them, its exterior weathered with age. As they stepped inside, the sterile smell of disinfectant and the hum of fluorescent lights greeted them. George approached the front desk, where a receptionist greeted him with a polite but disinterested smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," George said. "I'm looking for information about room 214. The receptionist frowned. "Room 214 hasn't been used in years. It's part of the old wing that was shut down." "Why was it shut down?" George pressed. "I'm not sure," she said. "Something about renovations that never happened." George thanked her and turned to the girls. "We're going to the old wing." Amelia's eyes widened. "Are we allowed to do that?" "Not exactly," George admitted, "but we don't have a choice." The old wing was eerily quiet. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. George led the way, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the dim corridor. "Room 214, he said, stopping in front of a door with a tarnished brass plaque. The door was locked, but George had come prepared. He produced a small toolkit from his pocket, a relic from his early days as an engineer. It only took a few moments to pick the lock. Inside, the room was empty except for an old filing cabinet in the corner. George opened it, rifling through dusty files until he found a folder labeled Confidential, 2015 Birth Records. "This is the year you and Willow were born," George said, pulling out the folder. Amelia and Willow peered over his shoulder as he flipped through the pages. Then he stopped, his breath catching. There it was, Amelia's birth certificate. But beneath it was another certificate. Willow's. Both certificates listed Eleanor as the mother. But where George's name appeared as the father on Amelia's record, it was conspicuously absent from Willow's. Instead, there was a handwritten note in the margin, "For private adoption, approved by Dr. Mendez." "Who's Dr. Mendez?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling. "He was the hospital's director," George replied, his jaw tightening. "And it looks like he's the one who signed off on separating you two." As they stared at the damning evidence, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. "Someone's coming," Willow whispered, her eyes wide with fear. George stuffed the folder into his bag and motioned for the girls to follow him. They slipped out of the room just as a security guard turned the corner. Back at the townhouse, George spread the contents of the folder across the dining table. The evidence was clear. Willow had been taken without his knowledge and placed into an illegal adoption scheme orchestrated by Dr. Mendez. "This goes deeper than I thought," George said, his voice heavy. "Eleanor must have found out about this and tried to stop it." "What do we do now?" Amelia asked, her voice small. "We expose them," George said firmly. "All of them. Mendez and anyone else who was involved." Willow looked at him, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. "What if they try to stop us?" George knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They've already taken too much from us. We won't let them win." As he spoke, George realized he was no longer just fighting for answers. He was fighting for his family's future. And he wouldn't stop until the truth was fully revealed. The next morning, George awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The folder of evidence from St. Mary's Medical Center sat on the dining table, a stark reminder of the battle ahead. He called Victor to share what he'd found. "This is big, George," Victor said, his voice sharp with urgency. "If Mendez was involved in an illegal adoption ring, there's no way he was acting alone. You're dealing with a network here." "I'm prepared for that," George replied. "But how do we proceed?" "You need to be cautious," Victor warned. "If Mendez or his associates get wind of what you're doing, they'll try to shut you down." George glanced at the girls who were sitting in the living room, engrossed in a puzzle. He lowered his voice. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe." Later that day, George decided to dig deeper into Mendez. He started with a web search, combing through articles and public records. Mendez had been a highly respected physician and administrator during his tenure, but after stepping down 5 years ago, he'd vanished from the public eye. No current address, no professional affiliations. It was as if he had disappeared. Amelia wandered into the study, curious. "What are you looking for?" "Dr. Mendez," George replied, not taking his eyes off the screen. "The man who separated you and Willow." Amelia frowned. Why would he do that? Didn't he know it was wrong? "He knew," George said grimly. "But some people only care about money or power, no matter who they hurt." Amelia was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are we going to find him?" "We have to," George said. "He's the key to all of this." That evening, George received a call from Victor. "I've got a lead," Victor said. "Mendez is living under the radar in a gated community in Connecticut. The address is in your inbox." "Thanks, Victor," George said. "I'll handle it from here." "Be careful," Victor warned. "If Mendez is hiding, he's got a reason. He won't go down without a fight." The next day, George drove to Mendez's address, leaving the girls with a trusted family friend. The gated community was pristine, with manicured lawns and luxurious homes. George parked a few blocks away and approached Mendez's house on foot, keeping to the shadows. He spotted Mendez through the window, sitting in a sunlit study. The man looked older than George expected, his hair graying and his face lined with years of guilt, or perhaps arrogance. George's heart pounded as he approached the door. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew this confrontation was inevitable. He rang the bell, a long pause. Then the door opened. Mendez stood before him, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "George Carter," Mendez said, his voice calm but guarded. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You know why I'm here," George said, his tone cold. "It's about my daughters." Mendez's expression didn't change, but George noticed a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You separated my twin daughters at birth," George said, stepping closer, "and I have the evidence to prove it." Mendez's face darkened. "You shouldn't have come here." "Why?" George challenged. "Because you're afraid of what I'll uncover. Afraid your little operation will finally be exposed." Before Mendez could respond, the sound of a car door slamming outside made them both turn. George looked over his shoulder and saw a man in a dark suit approaching the house. "Get inside," Mendez said urgently, pulling George in and slamming the door shut. "Who's that?" George demanded. "Someone who doesn't want you digging any deeper," Mendez replied, his voice tense. The two men watched as the suited figure knocked on the door, then walked around the perimeter of the house. Mendez motioned for George to follow him into the study. "You're in over your head," Mendez said, pulling a small envelope from his desk. "This is bigger than you can imagine." George snatched the envelope and opened it. Inside were photos and documents linking Mendez to a shadowy network of adoption agencies and private benefactors. "Why did you do it?" George asked, his voice trembling with anger. Mendez hesitated, then said, "It started as a favor for a wealthy donor, but it spiraled out of control. By the time I realized what I was involved in, it was too late to back out." "And Eleanor?" George demanded. "She knew, didn't she?" Mendez nodded. "She found out about the adoptions and confronted me. She begged me to stop. When I couldn't, she devised her own plan." George's chest tightened. "What plan?" "She wanted to reunite the families," Mendez said. "She left clues for you for others. I let it happen because I owed her that much." "Why would she trust you after what you did?" "She didn't," Mendez admitted, "but she trusted that I'd feel guilty enough to help." Before George could press further, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. Mendez's face went pale. "They're here," Mendez whispered. "Who?" George asked. "The people I work for," Mendez said. "They don't leave loose ends." George's mind raced. He grabbed the envelope of evidence and turned to Mendez. "You're coming with me." "No," Mendez said firmly. "If I leave, they'll come after you and your daughters. Take the evidence and go." George hesitated, but knew time was running out. He slipped out the back door just as footsteps approached the study. As he drove away, George's heart pounded with fear and resolve. He didn't know who was after him or what they would do, but he was more determined than ever to bring the truth to light and to protect his daughters at any cost. Back at home, George placed the envelope in his safe, knowing it was only a matter of time before the shadows came knocking on his own door. The envelope of evidence sat on George's desk like a ticking time bomb. The documents within had the potential to blow the entire adoption scheme wide open, but the danger surrounding them was undeniable. Mendez's final warning echoed in George's mind. They don't leave loose ends. Amelia and Willow sat in the living room, unaware of the storm brewing outside. George's priority was their safety, but he knew he couldn't keep them in the dark much longer. That evening, after securing the house's alarm system, George sat the girls down. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his tone somber. Amelia glanced at Willow, her brow furrowed. "What is it, Dad?" George hesitated, then said, "I've found the people responsible for separating you two. They're powerful and they're dangerous. But I also found proof of what they did." Willow's eyes widened. "Does this mean they'll get in trouble?" "That's the plan," George said. "But it won't be easy. The people behind this will do anything to keep their secrets buried." Amelia's voice wavered. "Are we in danger?" George leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I won't let anything happen to you, I promise." The next morning, George contacted Victor. "I have the documents," he said. "They implicate Mendez and a network of adoption agencies in the illegal separation of twins." "That's good," Victor replied. "But you'll need more than documents to take them down. You need witnesses, testimonies." George frowned. "Mendez might cooperate, but he's scared out of his mind. Do you think he'd go public?" "If he's smart, he will," Victor said. "But he'll need protection. This is a high-stakes game, George. You'll be exposing people with deep pockets and connections everywhere." "I don't care how powerful they are," George said firmly. "They stole my daughter and they'll pay for it." Victor sighed. "Let me make a few calls. We'll need to involve law enforcement and possibly the media. This story needs to be too big for them to cover up. George spent the next few days preparing for what felt like a war. Mendez had gone into hiding, but Victor managed to track him down and convince him to cooperate. Mendez agreed to testify, providing a detailed account of the scheme and the people involved. Meanwhile, George reached out to a trusted contact in the FBI, Agent Rebecca Nolan. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for taking down high-profile criminals, Rebecca was immediately interested in the case. "This is huge, George," she said, after reviewing the documents and Mendez's testimony. "If we play this right, we can dismantle the entire operation." "What's the next step?" George asked. "We need to organize a raid on their main office," Rebecca said. "But first, we'll hold a press conference. The public needs to know what's happening. If we shine enough light on this, they won't be able to operate in the shadows anymore." The press conference was held 2 days later at a downtown Manhattan hotel. George stood at the podium, flanked by Victor, Agent Nolan, and Mendez, who had reluctantly agreed to appear. The room was packed with journalists, their cameras and microphones pointed directly at him. George took a deep breath and began. 5 years ago, my wife, Eleanor, uncovered a horrifying truth. A network of individuals, including trusted medical professionals, was involved in the illegal separation of twins at birth, profiting from the pain of families like mine. Today, I'm here to expose that truth. He detailed the evidence, the emotional toll it had taken on his family, and the courage it had taken to bring Mendez forward. When Mendez stepped up to speak, the room fell silent. "I was part of the problem," Mendez admitted, his voice trembling. "But Eleanor Carter made me see the damage I'd caused. This is my way of making amends." The press erupted with questions, and by the end of the conference, the story had gone viral. Headlines like "Illegal Adoption Scheme Exposed" and "A Father's Fight for Justice" flooded social media and news outlets. That night, George sat with Amelia and Willow in the living room, watching the news coverage. The girls were quiet, processing the weight of what was happening. "Are they going to jail?" Willow asked. "Not yet," George said, "but it's only a matter of time." Amelia looked up at him. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" George smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "She'd be more than proud. She'd be amazed at how strong you both are." 2 weeks later, the FBI raided the offices of the adoption agencies and several homes linked to the network. Arrests were made and more documents surfaced, implicating dozens of individuals. As the network crumbled, families who had been torn apart began to come forward, sharing their stories. George realized that this was bigger than just his family. It was about justice for everyone who had suffered because of this scheme. He decided to create a foundation in Eleanor's honor, the Stars of Eleanor. Its mission would be to help reunite separated families and provide resources for those searching for their lost loved ones. Amelia and Willow helped him design the logo, a pair of stars intertwined, just like the ones from Eleanor's storybook. As George watched his daughters laughing together one evening, he felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were together now. And together they would honor Eleanor's legacy by shining a light in the darkest corners, helping others find their way home. Months had passed since George and his daughters first uncovered the truth about the adoption scheme, but the fight was far from over. The media coverage had sent shockwaves across the nation, bringing widespread attention to the issue of illegal adoptions. Families torn apart by the network began stepping forward, each story more heartbreaking than the last. The Stars of Eleanor Foundation, launched just weeks earlier, quickly became a beacon of hope for those affected. Volunteers and private investigators joined forces to reunite families, while donors flooded in to support the cause. George had never imagined that his family's pain could lead to something so transformative. One crisp fall morning, George stood on the steps of the federal courthouse in New York City, surrounded by a crowd of reporters and onlookers. Today was the culmination of everything they had fought for, the trial of Dr. Mendez and the key figures behind the network. Inside, Mendez sat at the defendant's table, his face pale but resolute. His decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors had earned him a reduced sentence, but he would still serve time for his role in the operation. As George watched Mendez take the stand to testify against his former associates, he felt a flicker of sympathy for the man. Mendes's guilt was undeniable, but his courage to come forward had made all the difference. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case, with documents, witness testimonies, and even financial records tracing the flow of money through the illegal adoption network. One by one, the guilty parties were exposed, their power and influence crumbling under the weight of the evidence. When the verdicts were announced, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and tears. Justice had finally been served. That evening, George and the girls gathered with friends, supporters, and families impacted by the scheme at the Foundation's headquarters. The event was both a celebration of their victory and a reminder of the work still to be done. Amelia and Willow had prepared a speech together, and George watched with pride as they stepped onto the small stage. "Tonight," Amelia began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "we're not just celebrating justice, we're celebrating hope. My mom, Eleanor, believed in hope more than anything. She left us a trail of stars to follow, and those stars led us back to each other." Willow continued, her voice soft but full of conviction. "Now we want to share that hope with others. The Stars of Eleanor isn't just about our story, it's about helping families find their own stars and bringing them back together." The audience erupted in applause, and George wiped away a tear as he watched his daughters embrace on stage. Over the following months, the Foundation's impact grew exponentially. Families across the country and even abroad were reunited thanks to the resources and support provided by the Stars of Eleanor. One of the most emotional moments came when a mother in Texas was reunited with her twin sons after 14 years apart. The reunion was broadcast on national television, and George and the girls watched from their living room, their hearts full of pride and joy. "I can't believe we're helping so many people," Amelia said, her eyes glued to the screen. "You're helping so many people," George corrected her. "This is your mother's legacy, and you've both brought it to life." As the first anniversary of the Foundation approached, George decided to organize a special event. A stargazing night in Central Park, open to all the families who had been reunited through the Foundation. On the night of the event, hundreds of people gathered under the clear night sky. Blankets and telescopes dotted the park, and the air buzzed with excitement. George stood with Amelia and Willow, gazing up at the stars. "Do you think Mom's watching us?" Willow asked, her voice tinged with wonder. George smiled, wrapping an arm around each of his daughters. "I don't just think she's watching. I know she's proud of us, all of us." Amelia pointed to a particularly bright star in the sky. "That one looks like it's twinkling extra hard tonight. Maybe it's her." Willow nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "Yeah, I think it is." As the evening wound down, George looked around at the families laughing, hugging, and sharing stories. It was a reminder of how far they'd come and how much good they could still do. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Eleanor's dream had become a reality, and George knew that her trail of stars would continue to guide them and countless others for generations to come. Together, they had turned heartbreak into hope, and together, they would keep shining.